You don't necessarily need a medical diagnosis. I think that this is a pretty common misunderstanding. Schools oftentimes will say to parents, well, there's no ADHD diagnosis or there's no, dyslexia diagnosis. We think that the student is just not putting in their best effort. I try to bring it back to what do we actually know? We actually know that these are the things that aren't going well in class.
Jessica, thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here and record this with you.
Yeah, I've just heard such nice things from families that have worked with you about your clarity through the advocacy process. So I'd like to dig into that.
Awesome. I'm very passionate about that. I think one of the things that I really try to do for parents is help them learn how to be better advocates because they're likely on this journey for a long haul.
Yeah. So let's start broad. A lot of our listeners have kids and they're starting to see some of these executive function challenges. However, they don't have maybe a diagnosis or they don't fit in a specific disability category. How do you help families make a case for accommodations when the school pushes back and says the student doesn't qualify?
Well, I think it's really kind of a little bit of a nuanced issue because I think that parents always have a gut instinct as to when things are not going right from their kids. And most of the time it's feedback that they've also received from probably someone at the school. So I think that to really get at like the root cause of what can be done to support the student, they really need to dig into kind of what the feedback is that they're getting. So I think that for a lot of kids with executive functioning challenges, things that come up at school are things like maybe the student is a little bit disruptive, they're not paying attention in class, they're moving around a lot, they take a lot of breaks, or they aren't being able to kind of meet the expectations of what the assignments are. They're not, finishing their work, they're rushing through a test. I think that these are all indicators of a potential disability. And so I think it's capturing it in a way that they can then present to the school to have a conversation about what the real issues are. And instead of having the conversation remain focused on what the student is not doing, I think they need to try to reframe the conversation to the skills that the student seems to be lacking and try to quantify that in a way that is helpful for a discussion about impact, because that's ultimately what it comes down to is, you don't necessarily need a medical diagnosis. I think that this is a pretty common misunderstanding. Schools oftentimes will say to parents, well, there's no ADHD diagnosis or there's no, dyslexia diagnosis. We think that the student is just not putting in their best effort. And I think that, I try to get away from those conversations and bring it back to, but what do we actually know? We actually know that these are the things that aren't going well in class. And so as much as the parent can kind of document, and then there is a process in place that schools have to address. Like if you come to a school and say, I believe my student has a suspected disability, and you don't have to say that you think it's ADHD. You can say, I think that they're having challenges with attention. I think they're having challenges with regulation. I think they're having challenges with reading. And I am making a parent referral for you to conduct a special education evaluation. I think when you kind of draw a little bit of a line in the sand with them and ask for a prior written notice, because that's what they're obligated to give you at that point, then you might see some things kind of change in their responses. And they said suddenly, all of a sudden, we'll do an evaluation.
Yeah. Thank you for laying that out. That was, Thank you for laying that out. That was, really beautifully laid out. That was like all my questions in one. How many times a week do you hear, I think the student can give a better effort?
Many times.
I wanted to make sure I normalized that piece of it because I think that's one of the biggest comments we get here. It's like, is this kid just lazy? Right. They confuse executive function with character issues.
Right.
You've got to hear that all the time.
Well, I hear it all the time. And I also hear when they choose to put effort in, a lot of language and verbiage like that. And I think what's interesting, and you can probably speak better to this than I can, but about executive functioning is I think that part of what the presentation of that is inconsistency. So I think when students are able to show something one day, the adults sometimes think, well, I saw them do that, so I know that they're capable of it. And so why would they not be able to do that this day? But I think that that's just what the barrier is that they also can't control the level of, inattention and the level of distraction and the level of other barriers that impact their ability to show that capability consistently all the time.
That is beautifully laid out. Yeah, that inconsistency piece. It often gets confused. And that's one of the core issues with ADHD specifically is this inconsistency piece. You spoke about data. being a formal special education teacher, this is something that we frequently ask for, right? It's like, well, what data do you have, or what documentation do you have for us to pursue an evaluation? How should families go about getting that? What does that look like? Is it spreadsheets? What exactly do you recommend?
Well, I think it can look like a lot of different things. There's no real hard, fast rule. There's certainly like more quantitative data. Like if you would happen to have testing, if you've gone to a private provider or a neuropsych and you were able to get a diagnosis, you certainly can share that with the school. But the school also has data. I mean, they're keeping data certainly on academic areas, which sometimes could tell us things. And I would say if there are results to that data that is, not meeting the expectations, I would definitely include that. And I would ask the school what kind of data they have. When it comes to kind of like executive functioning things, I think we're trying to more or less take information and present it more like data. So a lot of times I'll ask parents, well, how many times have you heard from the classroom teacher this month about how Johnny was out of the room and didn't come back, after 10 minutes, or, he was, distracting other students or blurting out in class and not raising his hand. And, how many times did she have to redirect him? Those are all, I think, pieces of data. And I think sometimes the schools, they're reporting those things, but they're not looking at it through like a disability lens as like a red flag, an indicator that something might be wrong here. And so I think sometimes I'm trying to take that information, which is why I always suggest to parents to capture everything in writing. It's really very important when we're trying to kind of synthesize information and have these kind of conversations around what does the body of evidence show. When you have it in writing, it's easier to point back to it and to quantify it in that way. You can say, well, I remember we've had 10 email conversations, Ms. Smith, about Johnny and his behavior in class. So I think it's okay to talk to your teacher and have a conversation, but I think you should always follow it up with an email and just kind of summarize what that conversation sounded like and what were the key points and takeaways. And that way we kind of have a paper trail that we can reference as well. And I think the other thing that parents oftentimes, and I run into, that they're working with outside providers, like maybe something like Untapped or tutors, private, speech pathologists, those types of things. You can bring your own data to the conversation too. And I think it's important to get those professional opinions captured in writing as well, and be able to also share that with the school of, hey, this is what we've been working on Johnny with. We're seeing these struggles with him being able to kind of access all the portals and know where to submit his assignments, and those pieces that can, just add to that body of evidence when we're trying to talk about, is there a suspected disability? Because that's actually the bar at this point. We're not saying, is the student going to be eligible for special education? We're not really saying, is the student going to be eligible for accommodations? We're just simply saying, is there evidence to support that there may be a suspected disability? And that bar is pretty low, in my opinion.
Again, thank you for laying all that out, and getting everything in writing is such a good piece of advice. And then having it all in one place. I know as a former special education teacher and school psychologist, when a parent showed up with like something organized versus like, I think my kid has a disability, like it's a very different conversation right away. It's almost like the parent who just shows up like, I think my kid has a disability, is almost brushed off in some ways. Versus if they have actual data with them, we're like, oh, like this is something we need to really focus on.
I think it's about helping them connect the dots faster as well, which is, is a skill that sometimes, parents also struggle with too. You have a lot of things on your plate and it's hard to keep everything organized. But what I find is when we can kind of show up with things kind of in a package, tied up in a bow, the schools are more receptive to it, because I think we've taken a lot of their workload off, unfortunately.
Yeah. I want to go back to something you said in your first explanation. You used the term, there may be a suspected disability. Mm-hmm. And I really like that, because I feel like that's a very different conversation than my kid has ADHD. It's like, well, I don't know. I'm a teacher. I'm not a doctor. Right. Mm-hmm. Is that the terminology that this is a suspected disability, and I'd like to make a parent referral? Are those the two pieces of terminology that you would recommend?
Yes, that is the language in IDEA, which is the Individual with Disabilities Education Act. So the requirement, schools have something called a child find obligation. And the language of that particular piece of the legislation is around a suspected disability. If there is reason to believe, and anyone can make that referral, right? It can be made from the school, it can be made from the parent. But if there is a suspected disability, then that is really what the child find bar is kind of set at. that's when we need to then do an evaluation to either eliminate the possibility of a disability or illuminate that.
Interesting. Okay, so that's the first part of the process. Let's go to a part of this that's maybe later on. If a parent has a kid with ADHD or a learning difference, and when they first enter that IEP or 504 process, there's a lot of steps there. It can get very confusing really quickly. What are the first steps the parent should take during that process?
Well, the first step in most of these cases, we kind of already talked about, it's really making that parent referral. And I would use that language. I would do it in writing. I think the best person to send that to always is one of the administrators of the school, your classroom teacher, potentially a school psychologist or counselor if they're also involved in that process. And then, that kind of puts the ball in the court of the school, right? The next step would really be for them to either decide to evaluate, which again, in my experience has happened 100% of the time. And what they will send to you next is something called a consent to evaluate, because they do need your permission to perform an evaluation that would be different than what they're doing for all kids in the public school setting. Once you sign that and give them that permission to evaluate, it will specify certain areas. So it's good to be clear about all of the struggles you think your student is having. If you go in and you say, hey, I just think my student might have reading troubles and that they're not, reading on grade level, it's very possible that all the school is narrowly going to look at is reading. And there's a lot of things that are comorbid with symptoms of dyslexia. ADHD is one of those. Certainly writing skills are oftentimes impacted as well. And then we oftentimes see, sometimes some social emotional issues around anxiety. So I think it's good to be clear, like just having the school evaluate does not necessarily mean you're going to get a comprehensive evaluation. So to be specific, I think Johnny's struggling with attention. I think he's struggling with some academic skills and what those might be. I think maybe he's struggling with his communication. As much as you can kind of capture all of those things, you're going to get likely a better evaluation. And then the school has 60 days to complete that evaluation. And once that 60 days has expired, they need to have something called an eligibility determination meeting, where the IEP team participants at that point, which includes the parents, would come together and then make a decision about if the student is eligible in one of the 13 areas of eligibility to receive special ed services. And if they are, then an IEP would be developed in that situation. If the student would not be eligible, then there could still be a conversation about a 504. Like maybe we found the student does have some academic skill gaps, but they're maybe not as significant. Maybe there are some attentional issues, but it's not rising to the level of like a clinically significant type of outcome. And certainly there are students that can be successful with just having some accommodations in place as well. And that can be delivered through a 504. And so if you ever find yourself in a situation where you're not eligible for special ed, I would definitely have a follow-up conversation about, well, how can we then talk about a 504 and if accommodations are appropriate?
Yeah. Entering that meeting, that eligibility meeting, is there anything parents should bring with them? Anything they should know? What does that look like?
Well, I do believe it's best practice, and I coach all of my clients, and I think it's always good to record the meeting. You need to understand kind of what the laws are in your state, since I know you have kind of a broader audience here in Colorado. It's a one-party state, so you don't have to necessarily disclose to the school district that you are recording, but I think it's very important to have a record of what did happen and what was agreed to and stated. So I think that's always a good best practice when you're attending any of these meetings. I think secondly, it's certainly good to ask the school district to provide you a draft in advance. Some school districts do this kind of as best practice, but one of the key components of IDEA is meaningful parental participation. And it's really hard, in my opinion, and I think this is one of the problems, the flaws of the system, is parents aren't sitting in, special education or 504 meetings every day like school staff. So they're very unfamiliar with the terminology. They're very unfamiliar with maybe the assessments that were used. It's really hard to process that all at one time in a meeting with maybe 8 people on the spot. So I think it's really important for parents to get those documents in advance so that they can kind of digest that. Maybe they want to talk with some of their outside, providers to see if that aligns, and be able to come to the meeting to have, an actual meaningful conversation about the student versus trying to just download all of the information at one time.
Yeah. I know, again, as a special education teacher, I'd be like, your student's least restricted environment, and I see this just blank look.
Right.
If you had to pick, let's say 3 to 5 terms that every parent entering this process should be comfortable with and they should spend time researching, what terms would those be?
I think it's important for parents to understand what a prior written notice is, which is often referred to as a PWN in school environments, because that is whenever a school decides to change or deny something in kind of the special education realm, they are required to issue you that. And I think it's parents don't really understand. I think that when I think about an IEP and which pieces are really important, I think it's important to understand not so much the acronyms, but I think that the sections of the IEP that are really key. And for me, that is something called the impact of disability statement, which should describe how the disability impacts the student in school. And so you could have ADHD, and maybe part of that impact is that you need to move around a lot, that you require redirection, that you need to work on kind of organizational skills or planning and prioritize. I like that to be pretty specific because that should dictate the other areas. And also, I think parents should be familiar with least restrictive environment. That is really what determines where your student will spend the most time when they're at school. How much of that time will they be in general education and how much of that time will they be in special education settings? And then I also think it's important for parents to understand service delivery, because that is really the key component of like what is going to happen differently for your student in order to be able to make the meaningful progress that they haven't thus far. And sometimes those are pretty vague statements, and I think we should try to make them a little bit more specific most of the time.
You said something so important that when you're going through this process, you're going to have so many legal terms thrown at you. And it's just good to have even a basic understanding of research of what these are ahead of time. I just remember so many deer in the headlights.
Right.
And I was coached by my district that I had to mention these terms in a certain way because that's the law. So I would love for parents to be more educated in some of that terminology.
Right. One thing kind of on our topic of kids that kind of fall into this realm of attention, and, I'm sure you have a lot of kids with like academic kind of learning challenges as well. I think that the things that I think are important for parents to understand about the eligibility categories are, and I think this is what trips parents up a lot of times, is that they go in and say, I think my student might be dyslexic. And the school reacts to that as if it's a medical term. So they immediately say, oh, we can't test for dyslexia because they're not able to diagnose dyslexia. So I think it's important for parents to understand the language that schools use when they talk about a reading disability or academic skill disability. And they refer to it as SLD, which is specific learning disability. And so if you go in and you just rephrase what you're asking for, I think my student might have struggles in reading, or I think my student might have a specific learning disability, you get a different reaction from the school than if you were to go in there and say dyslexia. And the same thing with ADHD, it kind of falls into this category called other health impairment that they refer to as OHI. And, again, if you ask them to evaluate for ADHD, they will tell you, no, we can't do that. But if you present it in a way of like, I think attention and focus are really impacting my student's ability to have success at school and benefit from school, it's viewed in a different context.
Yeah, that's why I really like that recommendation you gave earlier, the suspected disability. Mm-hmm. I'd like to make a parent referral because a number of times I had a parent come in like, yeah, I think my kid's having difficulty focusing. They have ADHD. I was like, don't we all have difficulty focusing, right? And I can't even assess for that. So that's one of the core things from this episode I'd love for people to take away from is that terminology. If you're finding this episode helpful, we'd be so grateful if you gave us a rating, subscribed, and shared. Also, as part of our mission to provide as many free, reliable resources to family, please visit us at untappedlearning.com. What if parents are unhappy with this process? I know this is kind of the world you live in, but let's say they go through their first IEP 504 meeting, or didn't have to be their first, any of them, and they're like, this just doesn't feel right. What can they do?
Well, there are processes in place that parents can utilize. Schools are required to give you a document whenever you would initiate this process. So if you don't get it, then you should know something's wrong. When you ask for an evaluation, when you go through an eligibility meeting, when you have an IEP meeting, they always need to offer you something called your parental rights and safeguards. And I don't know that many people read this. Here in Colorado, I'm actually happy they actually rewrote it last year and made it a lot more user-friendly. They had evaluated that it was kind of at a collegiate level, which was hard for some parents to process. So I think it's actually a really good tool. I think you should read it to kind of better understand some of your rights and what some of the dispute processes are. But if you get a result that you're not happy with, you can do some things differently. I always try to take the path of least resistance. I really don't want parents to end up in due process hearings or mediation. My approach is to try to work collaboratively with the school and find a solution that everyone can feel is appropriate. So what parents, I think, oftentimes don't know is that there's this whole other layer of support people that are available beyond your school. And so the first thing that I do when like a family calls me and says, hey, we've been asking for an evaluation and the school keeps telling us, that they can't do that and that, our student wouldn't qualify because, he has all A's and B's. And, we've asked 3 times and they won't let us, have this evaluation, which is very common, happens a lot to parents. The first thing I do is reach out to that area special education director that oversees that school. And every school district has a layer of these people in place and simply say, you can find this information out. I mean, of course, I, intimately know these people, but it's very, easy to find on a school's website, or you could even ask your school, who is the district kind of person over special ed that would work with this particular school. And they generally know the rules, the law, the requirements better. Again, it's not a foolproof situation because, there's a variety of people out there, and some people are really great at their jobs and some people, aren't so great at their jobs. And, you may run into that, but I largely think it's helpful to at least kind of start at that next layer and see if that person can kind of help you resolve whatever kind of problem and issue you're having. And sometimes it's just a lack of knowledge, a lack of training, a miscommunication, again, not using the same language that the school is used to responding to. And a lot of times I do think that those people can kind of help bridge some concerns and some gaps and maybe get you to a better place. Should that not work, because sometimes it doesn't, sometimes we're still at a standstill, then, there are different, dispute options that parents can go through. So if you would, if your student would have an IEP and you don't believe that it's being serviced appropriately, and you've tried to work with the school district to work that out and it hasn't helped or hasn't worked, then, you can file something called a state complaint. You can go back 1 year to file a state complaint. You can also file something called due process, which you can go back 2 years. You can certainly just request to have mediation through your state. They provide that. They provide a mediator free of charge. Both parties do have to agree to mediation. So that is the caveat of that. And then you hope that you can work through the process, but they're very daunting processes. For any of those options, the school district will have attorneys. And so it's not a fair matched situation most times if a parent, can't afford their own representation. So it's why, again, I really try to solve things as collaboratively as possible, because sometimes those processes, although they're available, they're very draining, both emotionally and financially, but sometimes they're also necessary in order to get to the appropriate result for the student.
Yeah. And something you humbly forgot to mention was that there's things called advocates out there, right? And so again, there's a charge, but if that's financially viable for you, there are advocates available who can really coach you through the process.
There are. And I think that, when you're doing this every day and in a variety of schools and districts and settings, it's easy to learn it's easier, I guess I should say, to learn, how to communicate with schools, how to, kind of get around some of these roadblocks. And certainly, having an advocate would be helpful in most cases. I don't believe everyone needs an advocate, but I certainly think that, if you're having a problem, it would be helpful to at least reach out to one. And there are some advocates that are, no cost. Like here in Colorado, we have the ACL, the ARC. They do have advocates. I'm not sure, how much they're able to really, dig in deep and help people, but every state is also required to have a parent information center. So here in Colorado, it's called the Peak Parent Center, and it's funded through, our education funding. So every state has this, and you can, call them. They have resources. They can talk to you. They can give you some advice. I would encourage parents. Again, this is also all in those parental rights and safeguards book. It'll tell you what your parent center is for your particular state.
The biggest misconception that I see is that when parents are towards the end of the high school process and their kid has an IEP or 504, they just assume that this is going to continue to college. That's one of the biggest misconceptions that I see. How do you help families prepare for that transition?
Well, I think it has to start, really when you start kind of your college search, if you're a student who is college bound, because IEPs are strictly for K-12 education. So if you are, there's preschool as well, but it doesn't go to college. There's no special education services in college. However, 504 is something that can follow you to college and to a workplace. It's a different set of kind of criteria. However, each college has different ways of delivering those services. And I would say that some schools are more disability friendly than others. And so when I have students that are planning to go to college, and we also know about them that they need accommodations to be successful, and they need certain environmental factors to be successful. As part of the college search, I think you also need to connect with prospective schools' disability centers and learn a little bit about how they work with students to help them get appropriate accommodations in place and what their process is. And if that seems like it's going to be a school that is a good fit for whatever that particular student's needs are.
Yeah. What's the biggest misconception you see? And it can be anywhere in preschool through college. That was my biggest misconception. What's a misconception you see that parents have? I
think that parents think that sometimes, these plans are gonna solve all of the issues. It's the one thing that if we just get that one thing in place, then everything will be fine. And, what I've seen over time, through my own personal experience with my own children and what I see with most clients is that it takes a lot of mitigating kind of factors to support a variety of different students. And so I think that's where I would just say that, there's no one stop kind of solution. I would always, look into all of the different avenues that can support a student with whatever their given challenges are, because I don't think that, even if 504 and IEP is always going to be like the magic ticket.
Jessica, I learned so much. Thank you so much for being here. Where can people learn more about you and your work?
Sure. Well, I have a website. It is advocatingforsolutions.com, and they can certainly go there and learn more about the services that I offer and different supports that I help families with while they're navigating the public school system.
Awesome. Thank you again.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on the Executive Function for All podcast. If today's episode brought you any value, please rate us 5 stars and share it with someone who may benefit. And remember, every small step you take builds towards your success. For resources and guidance, visit untappedlearning.com. Keep growing, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.